In this episode of the Toolbox, we'll take a look at 8 new and old CSS libraries and the way they're changing that you'll be writing CSS classes in the future. The pace of the web is relentless, and that's why you need the Toolbox. Hey everyone, this is Raibo, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Follow me and subscribe on LinkedIn and YouTube for more content. If you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog at raibo.org. So I've been on a journey lately with this toolbox. We're now at episode 22, and I was trying to make it something that was an exploration of new frameworks and ideas, so that hopefully whenever you try to figure out whether you should learn something, I will have made an episode on it and kind of helped you out a little bit. So that's where I started, and after 22 episodes, I've actually explored a bunch of different frameworks, CSS frameworks, as well as JavaScript frameworks. That's kind of been the focus so far. And one of the things that happened to me that was unexpected was that studying so many of the frameworks sort of changed me a little bit. So the libraries do things, and I started to see a kind of pattern that I think is pretty interesting, that I thought I would give you kind of like a report on what I've learned as a result of doing all these different explorations of especially cutting edge libraries. And today I'm going to focus on CSS. And it's really, I think I have a new perspective on where CSS is and what it's trying to accomplish. Usually the frameworks drive the development of things like CSS. So Sass, I think, had probably the biggest impact on this. It had an impact on the different sort of, additions that were made into regular CSS. The great example of that is, for example, variables were something that were added to CSS because of what Sass was able to do with them, and a lot of the other functions. To this day, though, I think you haven't seen a complete transformation of what CSS is based on Sass. There are some things that Sass does that I think that are better in Sass. So that's part of the things that I'm going to talk about, and then just talk about some of the new crazy frameworks that I have found just over time and going through these things. So I would love to hear in the chat what sort of frameworks you guys are using, what you think works really well for you, and if you've seen anything sort of interesting recently. I know a lot of people are into Tailwinds CSS, and that's one of the ones that I'm going to cover. But I have, I think, some pretty interesting one based on the things that I've been doing lately that I think you'll really enjoy. So let's go through all of those. Yeah, if you take a look in the chat, I would love to hear what everyone's using. And, if you have any questions also at all, make sure that you just put something in the chat, and I'll try to answer everything that I can here. We also have the amazing Dewanna Hartley helping me out today in the chat room, so she's going to also answer your questions if I'm talking too much and not able to see what everybody is typing in. So anyways, I'm going to start with one CSS framework that I think was probably one of my favorite finds. And let's pull this up here. And so this one's called Pico CSS. And I organize these in sort of logical order. I think like the most logical kind of order that I could find. And so this is not the first one I covered. It was maybe like in the middle of all the frameworks that I covered. But it was one of the most surprising, and it's one that I think I'm using quite a bit now, that I didn't even know existed before. So one of the things that I learned is that there's this entire series of frameworks or libraries that actually try to make writing CSS simpler. And I think this is the perfect example for this Pico CSS library. And basically what it does is it tries to do as much as possible without making you write any classes at all. So notice that you can type in an input field like this, and it makes it look pretty decent. And if you put in the different types, it's actually going to modify the design of the input fields very nicely. One of the first things everybody does when they're designing any website is first start off by normalizing the look and feel between the different products, or like the different browsers and devices. And I think that this library says, well, why do they have to be so ugly, right? When you go and you look at the defaults for any browser, it's usually like a Times New Roman, serif type font. And also, it's extremely ugly input fields. Like, you really have to work hard to make them look decent. The buttons, I'm not sure why the buttons look like they were designed in the 1980s. I feel like that's one way that CSS could improve, making everything, updating the look and feel, giving the defaults for each browser an update and a look that is like sensible. And this is what this library does. It essentially gives you really great looking classes for just the regular styles, so that you can actually design some pages without having to use any classes whatsoever. And this is why I put it first on this list of things that I wanted to cover, because it's pretty interesting. It has support for light or dark mode. Everything is responsive, so it has like a basic grid that is in there by default, and you just get everything looking pretty good without having to even do any classes. So if you take a look at some of these examples, you can see all of sort of the different components. And I happen to have my machine turned onto dark mode, and that's why we're getting dark mode right here. But the checkboxes or the switches are looking pretty good. And you can see the typography, the headlines look pretty decent. List items, I mean, they're squared up instead of circled. Here's what the links look like. There are a few built-in basic classes for this framework. But so you could see in instances there is like an alternate link class. I think this will cover it a little bit later on. But you can see all the different size headings. The images are block level by default. I mean, you literally spend a lot of time when you're designing something new, resetting everything and making like sensible changes. Make the images block level so that they are also the full width of the container. That would be a reasonable change that I think could be made to browser defaults nowadays, but that's one thing that hasn't changed at all. So do notice that there are a couple of different classes that you can use. So for example, you do have different types of basic settings. So you can create a primary button, a secondary button, or a contrast button. And then there are a few classes for outlines, because that kind of makes sense. So notice that the input fields are pretty cool. I think if you put input type search, then it gives you this sort of search thing. If it's input type text, it looks like this. A select looks like this. File browser button looks like this. It has valid and invalid styles built in. Everything just looks great. And I wish, tables, why do tables look so horrible by default on browsers? Why don't they just kind of look like this? And then you'd be writing on top of the sensible styles. So I think this library does that. Everything in here looks really good by default. And I think that this one really won my heart very quickly, because it just felt like, man, if somebody were to think about, instead of adding so many features to like browsers, this would be a great thing to add. Just redo the defaults. I know it would be a little bit controversial because there's so many normalized styles out there that you would have to rewrite those. But I think then you would have a lot of pages where the defaults looked pretty good. So let's see what else. I did do a sample of this. So later on today, you'll see at Raibo.org, I'll have all the links from this session. And I did do a sample on github.dev so that you could see, how to do a reasonable kind of layout with not a lot of style. So there's a navigation here at the top. There is a 4-column little layout for the cards. One thing that it doesn't have, it has like a way for you to create a grid, and it's essentially a flexbox grid that goes, the more items you add, the more room they'll take up horizontally. But it doesn't have a vertical sort of grid, so that's something that you have to kind of jump in there and apply some simple grid styles. But it does have cards, and the interesting thing about how you do cards is that whenever you want to put something and make it look like a card, you basically just create different articles. So it actually uses a lot of the tags to mean a design choice. So in this case, the article tag means that you want to put something in a card like this. And then you can bring in some logos. So you can see that the HTML here, it barely has any classes. So this is what I'm talking about. If you create a container and it has a class of grid, then it gives you this responsive grid right here with some room in between. And I do believe that there's also like a gap class that you can use with very few classes. And the navigation is a dream to do with this framework, with this library. Basically, you create a nav, and inside the nav, and they do have a couple of container types. So you can see that there's a container fluid. Also, the container types and the names of the containers, the handful of classes that it has, they match the Bootstrap grid. So if you are coming from Bootstrap, it's very easy to get into this. So you have container and container fluid basically. But in the nav, then you just create a list, right? And then in the list, if you want to have a branding section, so notice that I have like my logo here on the left. So if you want to have a branding section, you essentially basically just create 2 lists, right? The first list is the branding. And you can see that the branding here would have just essentially a SVG logo. That's why it looks big, but all it has is just that logo, I think, with some text. So list item with a logo, list item with some text, and that's it. That's how you make this branding thing. And then the second list is actually your navigation, and by default, that navigation will automatically go to and align to the right here. So it's making so many good decisions that I think you would make, and that perhaps would take you a while to do if you were just getting started. But it makes pretty sensible things. So you can add IDs, and notice that for this section here, we're just creating a headline group, and also things mean something in this framework. So H group groups these headlines together and spaces them a little bit tighter. So I think the defaults are great. You can still go in there and modify the classes to whatever else you need. As I mentioned, this div class grid does the little thing. And there's a lot of cool little features. I did do a video demo of this that you can find in my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/planetoftheweb. And once I put the post on the blog, you'll be able to see all the videos as well directly in the post. So I love this framework. I wish regular HTML worked like this. Another one that I think is really shocking is when you do, I have this way too big. So when you do let's see, where is the doc? So let's go to the documentation here. So the elements are pretty simple, shows you what the typography looks like. Buttons, there's a couple of buttons, and if you want them, by default they'll be 100% of the width of the container. And then if you add a roll button, then they become inline buttons. There is a contrast class that you can use and a secondary class for another color, and then you can add an outline variant. The forms look great. You can do some simple layouts using those grid classes that we mentioned. And this is what most people need for things. Tables look great by default. There is a striped rows. So a lot of times, when you have a lot of data, you want to do this kind of thing. Also, there's a few components. This is one of the components that if you have to do it in Bootstrap, it is so picky about how many things you have to add to it. So it's a dream to do things with this component, because all you do is you create a details class like this for the accordion. And when you want the accordion to be open, you just add the open property, and then it becomes an open accordion. So it looks like this by default. So to do this in Bootstrap, I am terrified of doing this in Bootstrap, because there's so many classes, IDs, all kinds of other things that you have to add to get this to work. Cards look good by default. They can have header and footers. Modals look pretty good, and they do have some sample JavaScript that shows you how to build this type of sort of bootstrappy modal. It doesn't have, like, the navigations are pretty simple. I just explained them to you. It does have a hamburger sort of menu option. Doesn't have as many things. There's no carousel. Definitely doesn't have as many things as something like Bootstrap, but I think it's made to help you create sites pretty quickly. So that's a lot about that specific framework. Let me just take a look and see if I see anything in the chat. I don't really see anyone yet. Let me check this thing out here. See if there's anything. Yeah, so there's quite a few things. Hello, everyone. Let's see. Peter made it back, so that's awesome. Hello, Peter. Peter is one of the regulars. Dawana is our awesome helper. She's been really awesome at volunteering to come and help out. So everybody sent her like a clap or something. This is cool. Junior front-end development. So yeah, connect with people. This is great. This is really good attendance. So I appreciate that. So Sass and Bootstrap for my job. I actually, so I'm going to cover those next and tell you what I think about them and where they fit into like the future. So Pico CSS is picocss.com. That's the URL. Really awesome. So the reason I call the show the Toolbox is because I feel like sometimes you don't need Bootstrap, right? If you're making a quick demo, like you've got a presentation, you're going to show some code to developers, this framework is perfect. Very, very quickly, it'll let you write things without having to worry a lot about, really building a complicated website. It's also a good first look and first sort of beginning. And also, this is a great way to begin your style sheet, right? Like this is essentially just a link to a style sheet. So this is a great sort of set of defaults for any site and that you could use right away. So yeah. Awesome, Israel. So yeah, I love this one. I've been using this one quite a bit. And yeah, I love Sass, and I'll be talking about that shortly. Evidently, I'm the man. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And wow, have a lot of people in the chat, so that's awesome. Would you build a hybrid Bootstrap and Pico? Probably not. I think that if I needed some of the built-in components for Bootstrap, I would just go with Bootstrap. But I really like where this framework is going. I really wish there would be some sort of petition that you could say, can we make the defaults work like this? Look at all of if people had something like this, writing CSS would be a lot simpler for everyone. So yeah, this could be, it might pair well with the React apps, but just hold on because I have a lot of other good stuff to show you today. So next up, I wanted to talk about Bootstrap, because I love Bootstrap. So the website for Bootstrap is getbootstrap.com. I'm a huge fan. As you probably know, I did the course on LinkedIn Learning on Bootstrap. I also did the course on Sass. So I'm a huge fan. And this is where I go whenever I have to build something quick that needs a good set of existing components. So something like Pico, really good for quick sites, but it doesn't have the depth of components that something like Bootstrap has. Plus, it's a good way. I think a lot of developers use this with designers to prototype things and then let the designers, prototype and, program where things are going to be, like cards, modals, that sort of thing. And then let a designer come in and customize the look and feel, which I think is great. 76,000 stars on GitHub. I mean, you can't go wrong with Bootstrap. The design has improved. I think that perhaps there's a newer design language that I think is better today, but it just has a great set of components. So if you go to like the documentation, just an amazing amount of components. Like, okay, the accordion is not a good one because I was mentioning this before. the amount of classes that you have to have for the accordion are ridiculous. Very difficult to write, very easy to screw that one up. But other than that, like, it has all these kinds of button styles and colors and really good stuff. If I have to build a quick website that needs something like a carousel, needs like some modals ready to go, I don't think Pico is quite there yet. Maybe it'll get there in the future. But just a great set of components. I think that's what I love the most. Everything you need to build a modern site ready to go out of the box. Now, on the bad side, I think that it has the naming conventions are confusing, and this is not Bootstrap fault. Like a while back, the industry went after this convention that came from a couple of different places, something called BEM and also SMAX. And the concept here was that to be consistent in the naming, that you would create sets of names for different classes. So you would name the parent component something like card, and then if you had a headline, you would call it like card headline or card header. And if it was an image, then you would say like card image. And that's what Bootstrap does. When you look at the more complex containers, you end up with a main class like this that says class accordion, and then each item has a class of accordion item. Then the headers have accordion headers. And then if you include a body, then that has an accordion body. So, the main class gets repeated over, and then each one of the elements, regardless of the type of like the class or the type of element that they are, reinforces the intent of the parent container, right? Which I think is fine, but it's really difficult to build these things sometimes because there's so many of them, and you have to remember that for every component. Although this is not a great example, but you have like the alert and then alert primary, and so you end up with like a ton of classes, and it just makes it, to my mind, it makes it like a little bit harder. So the cards, I think, are a good example of this. So you have like the card, and then the card body, and then the card title, and then the card text. And then in addition to that, you have like card headers, and then you can say like card image top, card image, there's other card image types, and then you can add lists which have their own sort of structure of classes. So what ends up happening is that everything that you write needs a lot of elements, a great number of classes. I am terrified of doing an accordion in Bootstrap for this reason. Be honest with you, out of all the things that I've ever had to build on any course, usually the problem with recording, like how to build something, is that you generally have to do it perfectly. And when I had to build a component, it was just really difficult to get everything correct, usually like in one take. Or if you don't get it in one take, then you have to go and edit a lot, or at least tell the editors how to fix things. So I'm really horrified whenever I had to record the accordion. So, having said that, I mean, if I was building simpler sites, this is my comfort framework. This is where I go when I need to build something that is just going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When I need something that does everything in one place. So it's really gotten a lot better too in the newer versions at being much easier to overwrite. So don't get me wrong, I love Bootstrap, use it to this day. My blog is actually it's like Sass Bootstrap, a Sass version of Bootstrap. So let me see if there's anything else in here and the comments as well. So Pico open source, yes. Yeah, Pico is open source, really cool stuff, and it's just a style sheet. So you can totally go in there and modify and take only what you need. So that is one thing that I have done in using it. Sometimes I need to show a website, but I need, for demos, it's fantastic because when you're showing the code, it's not like if you did something like Tailwind, it would be the code that you were trying to show with like 500 other classes. Same thing with Bootstrap, it would have like these classes that are not part of the demo. So that's one of the uses that I have for Pico, that it is fantastic for demos because it has only the code. You don't have to worry about the styles at all. So yeah, definitely open source. So check it out. And I have a lot of other goodies, up to some crazy things that you're going to see. So, thank you very much, Luliba and Javier. I haven't seen you in a while, so that's good to catch up with you again. So this is a good point. I have used Bootstrap and continue. Yeah, I still use Bootstrap. I have used it and would continue to use it for like clients. Yeah, it's a fantastic framework. I really love this thing. I have all the shirts, by the way, also. So definitely. All right, so let's keep on going. Next up, Sass. So Sass, again, huge fan, and I had been, I did the original Sass course in the library, or at least the last Sass course in the library, and I just finished. Actually, we just have a new version of this Sass course updated. And we kept on pushing back because it seemed like Sass was pretty stable, although in the very last version, they've changed a lot of small things that make you have to go, make you have to fix your old Sass code. But one of the things that I was sort of wondering when I went back and redid the Sass course is, am I really going to still enjoy using it? Is it still really relevant? I mean, Sass is 15 years old. There's almost nothing on the web that is 15 years old, right? But in the last available State of CSS survey, I was just looking through it because I check this survey all the time, and I ran into this graph right here, which shows you the sort of satisfaction for different technologies versus their usage. You can see the Bootstrap is down here. Something that you should it says take into account whether or not you should use it, I guess. But the only one, or the clear winner out of all the CSS frameworks / libraries was Sass. You have Post CSS here, which isn't really a library. It's sort of like a converter thing. But there's nothing else in here. Look at all the other ones that are over here on the left-hand side, right? Which means people really love them, but they don't really use them, right? The only thing that people really love and use is Sass. And I think that when I went back and I did the course, it's true. I love Sass. And I realized that there's a lot of things in Sass that CSS can't do and will never be able to do. And that's because Sass is a process language. So it lets you, the way that you create variables, the variables eventually become CSS classes. And so there's just no way that CSS is ever going to do that unless you're using something like Post CSS that takes CSS and converts it. So that ability to sort of convert and build makes it a real compelling platform. So I think us teachers are always promoting like super hot new frameworks, and you forget that people are actually probably using something that they've used for a while. And I think that this is where Sass comes in. It's very simple to learn. I think that it's very, very solid. If you try to go get a job, most places are going to want you to understand it. In the same way, I think you should definitely know Bootstrap, definitely know Sass, and then learn some of these others, or at least learn about some of these other things. So yeah, Juan Diego says Bootstrap and Sass is a perfect combination. That's totally, not a great piece, let's see. Bootstrap Sass, also the perfect combination. Unbelievably cool. There's actually a sort of version of Bootstrap that is Sass based. So I'll show you Tailwind, which I think is better in some instances for that. But Bootstrap and Sass, pretty awesome together. And I also did a course on that as well. So I'm going to show you a feature from that latest course that I just did, a feature of Bootstrap a feature of Sass that I don't think CSS will ever have. And it's called an Extend feature. So essentially what you do is you can create a base class right here, right? And in this class, you define an element like a button, right? The cool thing too is that Sass has this parent selector, which I don't think CSS has this quite yet, although I do think that it's coming. I don't know what's taken them so long. Sass has been around for 15 years, and this is one of the great features that you can refer to, the parent selector, like btn. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm adding a btn primary simply by calling the original and then defining a new version of it called primary, and then using the original definition here to extend the definition by modifying the color. And so if you take this is CodePen. So if you take a look at this and you look at the compiled CSS, it's pretty cool. It actually created all the classes for me automatically. That ability to process things is what makes Sass super special, and how well it's thought out. It's 15 years old, so it is solid, battle tested. But notice that it even recognized that when I was creating these new classes, it didn't actually just copy all this stuff and put it in the new class. It actually recognized that this button primary class is going to share a lot of descriptions or rules with the button class. So it just added them over here together, right? And it made my button primary and secondary, and then it created the separate classes for only the things that change between the two. That's Sass, I think, in a nutshell. It can do so many things that variables, regular CSS variables would never be able to do. I mean, it would just be more code in CSS variables, and it wouldn't be able to just output a very concise and well thought out. There's a bit of AI that's happening there to determine that, oh, you want to extend the class, so let me just figure which things I can define together and which things I can define separately. Mix-ins are like that too. You can very easily create like a loop that generates a bunch of code for you, which isn't something that this is a process language. It isn't something that CSS variables, even as cool as they are, is going to be able to do for you. So yes, Sass, managing, exactly. So I worked at Tribune Interactive, and I designed some of their larger sites. So it's exactly what I would use for managing large code bases. I would maybe think of Post CSS. There are some really good projects in Post CSS, but if I was doing something big, this is what I would go with. Managing a design system, I think Sass is a really compelling way. Nesting, yeah, there's lots of really awesome features. Not just this feature, but I picked this one because I thought this is a real compelling feature that there's no way you could do this in CSS. You maybe could do something like this in Post CSS, but it's such a compelling feature that I think that it's just awesome. Yes, you can't really use Sass in plain HTML. It has to be processed. I mean, most products like React or whatever, they have built tools, so they will allow you to do you have to do some sort of processing on most sites. But if you're just wanting to build a simple thing, then yeah, because it's a process, you can't really just start using Sass. Although there's some, like CodePen has, for example, a live compiler for SCSS. But it does require a build process, so that's a good point. Okay, let's see. All right, so let's keep going on with my next gem, which is going to be something called Pollen CSS. And I put these in order. So first I showed you Pico, which is just crazy, no classes, right? So basically, Pollen is a set of CSS variables that have been pre-built for you. So think about if you were building a modern site today, and it wasn't a component-based site, you would probably want to create like a series of variables for handling different kinds of things. Pollen is essentially a set of variables that somebody created for you that would be a fantastic starting point. So you could see that there are typography variables. It has a typography scale. And if you look at the scale, it's pretty similar to something that you would find in Tailwinds CSS. So this is a great sort of default starting set of variables that you could use for any project. You have a layout scale, same thing, like a Tailwinds CSS has a pretty similar kind of size property layout scale. And it all adds them in as variables that you can go in there and modify. So for user interface, you have border definitions, border radius, elevation for the box shadows. That's a little bit odd to think of it. There is a basic grid. It's very basic stuff, and it has also a set of colors that you can see right here. So I think that this is a good one if you are thinking of creating your own variable definitions. This is like a great set of presets that have already been made and thought out in a sensible way, I think. So that's where I would use something like this if I was building my own set of variables. This is a good starting point, unless you've already done it for other things. But I like the scales. Their scales are similar to other things. A nice color palette, simple, grid type components. It's no different than you using your own variables, but it's a nice place to start. And I think a lot of people are looking at how to use variables. You're going to see some other projects that use them in just a minute. So I did do, I did do a video on this, and you can watch it on YouTube. If you use CSS variables heavily, I don't know if you do, this is a good starting point. But CSS variables are great. There's nothing wrong with them. And as you'll see, you can do some really powerful things when you combine them with other frameworks. All right, so next up, I'm going to show you one called OpenProps. Now, this was another surprise for me. So OpenProps is like Pollen, except that is much more configurable. So it's essentially another set of pre-built variables. I think it has more options than Pollen. Pollen is kind of smaller and concise, but the difference here is that it is designed to be a lot like something like Tailwinds with scales, with certain scales. But one of the big differences is that you can install as little of it or as much of it as you want, and things have been broken down into different CSS little pieces. So if you're not using animation, you could just load up whatever thing you need, by just loading the specific piece that you're using. And look, they're adding a bunch of other additional utilities. So this is a growing library with really good presets. You can use the presets that have all of the stuff already. So, it's only 3.4K, but it's a set of variables that has everything in it. Or you can use specific ones plus individual, CSS styles. And it's very much integrated into like tools like NPM, so you can do this dynamically. And if you're using something like Vite, which lets you import CSS styles, it's very easy to import these things into something like Vite. So you can use at the CDN with no installation. You can use Post CSS. So this feels to be like a Pollen 2.0 or 5.0 that is just much better designed, and you can also have it take a look and ship only the props that you need. So pretty interesting. I thought that was a cool product. It does also have a IntelliSense Visual Studio Code extension that brings it again to another level above Pollen, just by making it a little bit more production ready, I think, and more useful. If you're using variables, I think this is a fantastic way to go. The language is really simple. So the language, notice, is just like variables, except that you can choose a color number. It doesn't exactly match Tailwind CSS, but it's pretty similar. And so you would just use it as if you were using variables. They've just all been pretty fine for you. I think that the basic thing with OpenProps is the flexibility and the customization of what you can do with them. So I show you a lot of examples of gradients and other things. So pretty cool, I think. If you use variables, I would take a look at both of those. I think Pollen is like a little more ready to go. OpenProps more customizable, and perhaps I like that they're adding new things to it. Also, some built-in easing and animation features, which I would love to see developed a little bit more. In a pretty simple language. So I don't know what squish is. Yeah, I guess it squishes them a little bit. That's pretty cool. All right, so let's keep on moving on to see what we have next. So next up, I want to talk about the big one, Tailwind CSS. Now, this is one that it's been pretty much the buzz in the web development industry. It uses something called a utility-first approach, and this is super controversial because unlike something like Bootstrap, it has absolutely no components out of the box. So the way you define things is by using classes that very closely match what the style attribute in CSS will be doing. So it's very much, for example, you can see that there'll be like a text LG. That means text in the large font. Let's see, that's actually not the great. So for example, you have like the rounded classes where you can define what the edge looks like. Well, that is, something that matches a CSS style. If you take a look at the utilities, everything in CSS has a Tailwinds class version. So, you have margins, you have widths, you have max widths, you have max heights, you have font families, font sizes, text alignment, and they are essentially, you notice when you go to a lot of these, you'll see that the class name in Tailwind CSS, it's almost exactly like the class name in CSS. And this is done on purpose because it's made to be a clone of CSS, which makes it easier to learn, although the names of things sometimes vary a little bit. So I don't know if I can find a good example. Yeah. So for example, text decoration. It's not called text decoration the class in Tailwind CSS is not called text decoration line underline. It's called underline, which is interesting, but it does, on the bad side, it makes it harder for you to figure out what the proper class name is, because it isn't always called what you think, although the names try to be simpler. They don't always get it. The other thing that's pretty interesting about Tailwinds is that even brand new features are quickly added into the library. So one of the things that I thought was pretty cool was this scroll snap align class that I didn't even know CSS had, but it's a newer addition to CSS. But that has already been added to classes. And so what this class does is, as you're scrolling any element, it allows it to snap to a position. So right now they're snapping to like the center snap point right here. See, they're not going smoothly. It doesn't let me go, or if I let it go, it snaps back to a specific position. So that is actually one of the strengths of this framework, that it keeps on adding classes as soon as they come out into into the library, which is pretty cool. Now, and I think that when I first started learning this library, I thought, well, why? I asked myself this question, like, why wouldn't I just use the style attribute if they're so close? Well, the actual superpower of Tailwind is that it has all of these modifiers that let you control how components behave in different states. This is really the powerful thing about Tailwind CSS. So I think you saw a little example of this on the homepage. Notice that what it's telling the framework here is that if this happens to be dark mode, if your computer is set to dark mode, change the background to this other color. So you can define modifiers by using this colon in the class names that lets you treat the design differently in different instances. So you could say at a certain breakpoint, I want you to modify whatever. So see, at a medium breakpoint, this becomes a flex element. Also at a medium breakpoint, I remove the padding here. And so the whole thing is designed so that you can add all of these properties. And I'll show you an example of this. And this has to do with dark mode. Well, it looks like I did. I don't know if I actually loaded up the example, but you can see this example right here is a good example. And they also sell this thing called Tailwind components that are good examples of, all kinds of designs that you would have. And you can take a look at the code, and you can see that you're heavily using a lot of these, different media query classes that will modify the design based on the width of the browser in this case. But there's so many. I think the greatest thing about Tailwind is that there are so many classes that let you control how to change the design on every media query, every state. So you could do something on hover. You can do pseudo attributes like first line, first character. Everything can be controlled directly. And what makes it great is that by placing everything with the HTML, it means that you never have to worry about overwriting anything. So that's the advantage. You never worry about overwriting things, but you have to worry about writing a ton of classes. Now, there's ways of shortening it, but it's not made for simple websites. It's really perfect for things like React, Vue, Svelte, any of the frameworks. So this is not what I go when I need a simple website. But if I'm building something in React, I don't use Bootstrap anymore. I use this instead because it's perfect for those kind of instances. Tailwind's a bit wordy when it comes to classes. Even doing like a button takes a load of classes, takes like almost like 2 sentences worth of classes. There's ways around that, but it's not something you want to use for whenever you have to repeat a lot of content. For simpler sites, it's just not the right thing. So that takes me to the next one, which is called, it's very similar. And I almost didn't mention it today because its job is to be a clone of Tailwind. So Windy CSS came out a while back, and it is essentially a clone of Tailwind. So much so that the class names are all exactly the same for both of these frameworks. Now, what this framework did was it added a couple of things to Tailwind, and the reason I didn't want to mention it, so I'll be very quick with this, is that the features were basically things that have already been added into Tailwind 3. So the features were a just-in-time compiler. One of the advantages of Tailwinds and Windy CSS is that whenever whatever class names you're using in your HTML or JavaScript, those are the only classes that will be output. So whereas when you load Bootstrap, you load the entire thing. It doesn't matter if your page doesn't use tables, it's going to load all the table classes. It's going to load all of the card classes, like whatever, whether or not you're using any piece of it, it's going to load everything. Whereas with Windy and now Tailwinds, whatever only the classes that you're using are going to be generated into CSS. So whereas something like Bootstrap might be like 80K or 100K or whatever it is, with Tailwinds you'll end up with like a 5K CSS rule, because that's all that outputs, because you're only using like a couple of things. So that's super powerful for component-based architectures. The ability to only release the things that you're using makes that framework super fast. Now that's what Windy CSS was trying to fix in Tailwinds, and they did such a good job that Tailwinds just copied it in version 3. It does have, the current version of this does have a few additional features, but they're so mild, compared to what Tailwind CSS has. So it has a way of doing, a few things. Something called attributify, which changes the way that you write the classes. I haven't seen that in Tailwinds, and there's a couple of other things, but nothing major. And honestly, I would just stay with Tailwinds, because it's as good as Windy is nowadays. So now let me get into the crazy experiment. This is like the part that I call, what are these people even doing? And that is with a framework called Assembler CSS. This thing is just nuts. So think about what Tailwind CSS tried to do. Make everything a utility class. And one of the things that I said when I was discussing that framework or that library was that my first question was, okay, well, if all the class names in Tailwinds are clones of styles, why don't I just use styles, right? Why don't I just add a style tag to every element and then just put the style in there? Well, that is what Assembler CSS is actually doing. I did mention that the advantage of Tailwinds is the modifiers. So this is actually helping you write in a way that is closer to the way that you would write style attributes in CSS. And this is pretty cool. You start off by just adding a script tag with the link to the Assembler CSS. Notice that it's a script tag. It's not a CSS tag. So this is interesting, because it is actually going in there and modifying your pages, right? You can also do unpm, but let's see if I can do getting started, because I think this has, I want to go to core concepts. Okay, so this is how this works. You can, if you wanted to style a square like this, you could write it out in regular CSS using the style tag, right? Just like this: background color, width, height, border, radius, and all that stuff, right? In Assembler, you can do the exact same CSS by, instead of using a style attribute, you use an X style attribute and write the exact same code that you already know what to do. The reason for this is they want to make it easy for you. You don't have to look things up if you know CSS. You just write the style attribute like you would in CSS. So the weird thing is that adding an X attribute is almost like adding a data attribute in HTML. They are both valid legal HTML. So although it looks weird that you're using X-style, it's perfectly fine. It's gonna validate just fine if you're using a validator, right? So that's cool, but why wouldn't you just use the style attribute? Well, the thing is that it has like shortcuts that map to Tailwind CSS shortcuts. So this is the other cool thing. The names of the shortcuts match what you would do in Tailwind CSS. So that means that it's very easy to pick up. So you have like BG, that's how you do a background color. And then you have W for the width, H for the height. So maybe not always map 100%, but notice that, yeah, the radius class is a Tailwind CSS class. And then, the shortcuts match what you would use in a normal framework. But they're just shortcuts of styles that you would use in CSS. The next thing is that you can define variables, which means that you can use CSS variables and then call them instead of saying, okay, well, instead of hard coding your colors whenever you modify a style, you can actually just go in there and refer to a CSS variable. And that's when it's getting interesting now, because now we can use the power of the existing CSS variables to, create a style that can be all over the page, right? The other thing that it does is let you control things with modifiers as well. You can, there is a bunch of preset styles, but you can create mix-ins just like you can with CSS, with Tailwinds. Now, the way that you do mix-ins and Tailwinds is a little bit complicated. You have to go into the CSS that gets imported and modify one of the 3 different styles, like the base style or one of the other styles. With this, all you do is you create the mix-in in the root variable that you would normally use in CSS, and then you define all the properties that mix-in would have, and boom, you're done. Now you can use that mix-in by using, in your project, just by referring to it like this. The configuration for assembler, much better, I think, than Tailwind. So way to go. So that's pretty awesome. You can also, because you have access to variables now, you can also use those variables as you're defining the shortcuts as well, which is pretty cool. And then it just like, as I mentioned, the cool thing about Tailwind is not the utility features, it's the modifiers that make it super powerful. So you have all these different states available for you to modify things. There's one small change that when you do these, they do work just like they would in Tailwinds. So you do have to say color.hover, for example, tomato. So you modify when somebody rolls over the element, you're saying, I want you to modify the color to tomato. So the syntax is a little bit different than Tailwinds, but if you understand Tailwind CSS, this will work pretty well. And so, I don't know that there's anything else. It's almost the same thing as Tailwind, except that it tries to do everything. And notice that if I was writing this, I would never have to use a style sheet. Just like with Tailwinds. The nice thing about Tailwinds is you don't really ever go into your style sheet. You just type in the styles where you need them. So this is pretty cool. Let's see, what else do I have in here? Configure things. Oh, so you can also, this is pretty awesome. You can configure you can also use data attributes, and I don't know if I have a good example in here, but you can also configure different things within the platform, how it works by using data attributes. I think it might be under custom elements. No, I don't remember where. Maybe virtual properties. No, that is just states. But you can actually configure things, and the ability. So this almost feels like what CSS should eventually become. Like these features should be in CSS a lot. If CSS was able to manage modifiers, then you really wouldn't need something like this. Perhaps having some variables that are shortcuts to this would be pretty cool. But I think this is sort of like where I think CSS could be going in the future, mainly by giving you access to allowing things like states that then let you modify a class based on the state of the browser. If they added that, I would be all in. So cool. All right, so as I mentioned, if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see videos for all these if you want demos. I mean, I don't have a video for Sass or Bootstrap, but you can, if you have LinkedIn Learning, you can watch them there. Now, I did want to mention a even crazier, newer one so it's called unocss. So this is like, okay, so the person who developed Windy CSS, and this is actually one of the reasons I included it. The person who developed Windy CSS realized, hey, they're just copying everything I did. So maybe I can rethink how to do CSS in the future. And so they are working on this, what they're calling instant on-demand atomic CSS engine. Basically, it's a lot of the features that you're seeing in Assembler, but in a much more modular way with less configuration. So it claims that it's super fast, 3.5 kilobytes, 0 dependencies, browser friendly, no parsing, no AST, no scan. I don't know what AST means, so maybe somebody knows what that is. So it doesn't have to analyze anything, because I think you're just putting things directly in the HTML, just like you do with Assembler and Tailwinds. And it does have the attributify mode, so if you want to read about it. So I think this is a really interesting one, but it is like on version 0.27, so it's nothing that I would worry about quite yet until maybe you'll see a demo from me in the future about this. But it's not really quite ready. So you can see that it's on version, I think, 0.27. Let's see. Yeah, 0.27.2. So not even close to a 1.0 version yet. But you know, and I feel like in reading all the stuff, I felt like it's a little bit closer to Assembler CSS. So I think one of these two might have a huge impact. There's the thing with a lot of these frameworks that once somebody comes up with a cool idea, it's a lot of times easier to just go ahead and rethink, like redo. And it's really part of the pain of being a web developer, that you have to worry about the future of where things are going. But it's part of our jobs, part of what makes it interesting. Hopefully that was pretty useful. I wanted to just show you like my journey, and I'm starting to sort of organize things. I think I loved Pico. I loved Assembler. Like, I totally wish I could use Assembler. It's just that I feel that it's not big enough yet. But I feel like that's where CSS, as you've seen CSS adopt some of the things that Sass does. I think that if CSS was able to adopt like the state modifier language, it'll probably end up being more like Assembler, because if you look at Assembler CSS, it's also taking consideration the syntax that CSS already uses and showing you that you could create something that had all these, you know, additional features that Tailwind is offering, but was a little bit easier and required less configuration. And so I think that those two are good examples of perhaps what we'll be seeing in the future. So that's all I have for you guys. Let's see. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Yeah, cool. Yeah, some of those frameworks are pretty cool. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Let me know, I guess, in the comics. Abstract, I don't know what you mean by that, Peter, but you'll explain that to me later. So, but yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff happening. This show is about giving you a peek into everything and letting you kind of, usually I have, for every one of those videos, I have like a, you know, either a code pen or some type of, I do like a lot of code swings on GitHub, some type of thing that lets you play around with them. I'm going to go play around with more of them in the future. So just keep watching and let me know if there's anything you find that is pretty cool, that you don't want to spend time messing around with it, but you would like me to check it out. I am a junkie for new frameworks. They keep me on my toes, I guess. So let's see. Is there a specific framework to new developers? I think Pico is a good idea. I think you really need to know Bootstrap, and I think you really need to know Sass. So definitely put those on your list of things that you should know to be to be sort of hireable. I think those are probably, I'll make sure I know those two. If you are getting into the type of development that requires components, like if you're getting into React and you're getting into Vue, then definitely go with Tailwinds. Hold everything else. Everything else is, doesn't have the support of those three, but those I think are the three interesting and big ones. I don't believe in saying that there's the one that's the best is this one. I just think that, like when you go fix something and you go find the tool that you need for the job, it's really horrible to try to use like a flat screwdriver on a Phillips head. It just doesn't work very well. That's kind of how I feel about the tools. They're just tools. Each of them are specialized, or they're trying to solve a problem, or they're trying to move the platform forward. But I think you definitely need to know Bootstrap. Still, definitely need to know Sass and possibly Tailwinds. Those are the three that I think, if you have those. But definitely start in that order. Like start with probably Bootstrap, then get into Sass, because Sass just makes your life easier. And then Tailwinds, if you're into components, then definitely learn that. It's the best one. Look, I said it's the best one once, even though I said there was no best one. Yeah, assembler is pretty cool. AST, I don't really know. Peter, I don't really know what you mean by that. But oh, I'm sorry, that's abstract syntax tree. So I'll have to go find what that is. Anyways, I have a meeting coming up. So good talking to you. Don't be a stranger. Write me a comment. I'm on LinkedIn and LinkedIn Learning. So go check out all the other things. I appreciate your time. And thank you for being here. We'll talk to you soon.